Hello and welcome to Tea Time. I am T. The reading room is now open. I'm going to address the issue of human trafficking in this episode, and we usually don't think about antebellum slavery as human trafficking. It sort of occupies a different space in the mind, but indeed it is just labor exploitation and human trafficking, which are still occurring today at greater numbers. And so it's important to understand that the United States Civil War ended slavery in the United States, but that is only the legal abolition. It still exists, and it's not necessarily race-based, but it's a lot of other factors, and we'll look at in a moment. So you can find your own source for the origins. I assume that slavery and exploitation of people has occurred since the beginning of civilization. I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest that. Into the New World, some people found opportunity to claim land through brutal means, and then there were natural resources that could be exploited for personal financial and collective financial gain. And for a number of different reasons, the preferred method for the leaders of that time and for those who were standing to gain the most power and property and capital was to exploit Africans. In the Mississippi secession document, the rebels mentioned the, quote, tropical sun, even though Mississippi is far from the tropics, and I'll look at maps in a moment. But it is hotter than England, I suppose, and so it's really quite disturbing, but that's what they wrote in there, that the black Africans were more suited to the tropical sun of Mississippi. So basically what that means is that a bunch of old Anglos who wanted to sit around and drink sweet tea and talk about politics and chum it up, drink whiskey and sit on the porch mostly, and couldn't bear the thought of working, but they wanted a bunch of money and they wanted the proceeds and profits of a great deal of work. And so to the extent possible, they exploited people. And you can see that, there's a lot of numbers. My main theme in this podcast episode, other than drawing attention to the fact that this is human trafficking, and which still exists, is that there are methodological issues, methodological concerns in the way historians use numbers. And a lot of history books and history articles have numbers, and numbers are great. They help to shed light on things. But they can also be misleading, and in the case of counting people in history, it's just a guess, first of all, and then I'll show how what seems like accurate or reliable statistics actually kind of paint a picture over something that maybe colonists and proud Americans, especially in the South, didn't want to really look at still. And so without further ado, let's look at the numbers. So we've got a growing number until the 1700s, 1701 to 1811, peaks at 6 million slave trade from Africa. And that's going to the New World generally. So over here in this table, you've got the destinations. These are from the most reliable sources we have. And again, I think it's kind of hilarious that they've got the ones digit. These are clearly estimates that we can't even count people today, let alone reliably count people 300, 400, 500 years ago. But let's take it at face value anyway. Coming to mainland North America, they're estimating 305,000 total of the 8 million, nearly 9 million people in total. The second most popular destination was Brazil after the Caribbean, then Spanish mainland Americas is going to be like Mexico and Central America, and then other places in Africa, and then other, I'm not sure what other is over there on the right, 166,000. Only claiming 7,600 went to Europe. And these are based on ships' manifests, so odd as it seems, they were just bold and had no shame whatsoever. They were just recording things and proud of their, they were being diligent captains, I suppose, on those ships, in their opinion. And, they were what do you call it? They were cataloging their shipments, which was people. So I found this on a SAT preparation website, and you can see that as cotton production increases, so does the slave population in the antebellum South, and that's what we're going to focus on here mostly. There were other destinations that received far more slaves, according to the record. However, there is the most focus on the American South when it comes to transatlantic slavery, and possibly that's because the United States ended up being the richest country. If Brazil ended up being the richest country in the region, then there'd probably be proportionally more focus on slaves who went to Brazil. Or if the Caribbean islands managed to sell that much rum and I don't know, whatever, if they were industrialized and had a GDP higher than the United States, then I suppose we'd all be shocked and appalled at their slavery rather than so much at the United States. Or ideally, we're just kind of taken aback by the idea that we're trafficking in persons and then exploiting them for labors on, to any degree. That humans do this to other humans. So let's look at this little fancy map from the University of Oregon. Starts in 1790, goes till 1860. 1860 is pretty much the end of slavery, or certainly the start of the end. And looking at the spread of cotton and slavery, they kind of model each other. So in 1790, the slaves are probably held for domestic servants and then farm work, but also tobacco. Tobacco was the big crop over there in South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia. And you can see that's where most of the slaves are. That's where the highest concentrations of slaves are. And then you can see cotton starting to pop up in Georgia, Virginia, going a little bit north in Louisiana, and then it grows along, is that the Ohio River there, by 1810. By 1820, it's spreading even further west. You can see more land under cotton decade by decade, and you can see also that the slaves increased in number exponentially as cotton increased, as cotton plantation increased. And generally when we think about slavery in the United States, we think about cotton. And never mind that the northern factories were processing the cotton, and never mind that the European demand for cotton garments, sort of fueled all this. But generally we think of the American South as the source of cotton and therefore also the slavers. So, but there's a little bit something wrong, there's something not quite right about this picture if we look at the prohibition of slave trade in 1808. So the federal government did ban the trade of slaves in 1808, which is going to be like this picture right here. But you can see almost all of the cotton growth, land and cotton growth, and almost all of the slave population growth occurred after 1810. And a number of different states hadn't even come into the Union, which was then soon to fall apart into the Civil War, until after 1810. So in a moment we'll just go fast forward here. You can see that Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Missouri, Arkansas, Florida, Texas, These are some of the states with the highest number of slaves, and they didn't even come into being until after the ban. And we'll see a couple tables in a moment that show the growth in slavery throughout that region. As you can see, cotton spread basically from 1820. In 1820, Mississippi, Alabama only had a little bit of cotton. By 1860, Mississippi and Alabama are under a lot of cotton, as is East Texas, Arkansas, and up the Mississippi River, Louisiana. So the United States federal government banned the slave trade in 1808, and this Clotilda was believed to be the last slave ship to reach the Gulf Coast in Mobile in 1860. Right? So it had been banned in 1808, and then 52 years later, what they think was the last slave ship reached Mobile. Was it the last slave ship? I mean, if there's still human trafficking today, they're not coming on ships, but chances are this is where history really makes a mess of numbers, and that's my peeve in this episode here, that the methods of the historians are spurious. They're questionable. And so I suppose this is their qualifier, that it was across the Middle Passage. Now, if 10 million people were transported into the Caribbean and Western world, then just because they're not coming across the Atlantic doesn't mean they're not being put on ships and transferred all around the region. And we'll get into that shortly. So it becomes a crime of piracy. Slave trading becomes a crime of piracy in 1820, which means it's a capital offense. But even historians are honest enough that they'll say it wasn't very well policed. I mean, the stuff is still illegal today, and people still trade in it. You know, last I heard, cocaine was illegal, and it has been for quite some time. But people still smuggle it across the border. Last I heard, one needed a visa to enter a country, and still millions of people are entering the United States. So policing is not exactly a forte, despite all of the proud police, you know, all this stuff. So this is an interesting story. You know, like I said, they're just bold. They keep catalogs of their human cargo. 110 people made it across the ocean. They made it to port. They made it to port there. And the captives were taken off the ship, and then they were moved around to different locations to avoid detection. The ship was abandoned, set afire, and sunk in the Mobile River. The U.S. Marshal actually found the captains at a plantation, north of Mobile. He counted 103 captives, so 7 disappeared. But before they could be taken by the authorities, they were moved again and lost with the help of some friendly local judges and district attorneys. And I think that's not surprising. The idea of a corrupt official is not exactly news. Despite all of the proud posturing by the Anglos, you know, they've got those big bellies and they swing those things around and speak that fancy English, but, you know, if you just don't pay attention to the tone of their voice and actually think about it, then it's not all that hard to imagine that, well, golly, you mean the law was in, you know, like, they did secede and they were slavers, and so it's not exactly like they were morally upstanding people. So there it is, you know, and we've got record after record after record showing that there was recorded slave trafficking and trafficking in persons in violation of the law. And for some reason, that means something different to people. Now, okay, so the Congress and their plenipotentiaries over there in Washington got together and it decided to write something on paper. And now it just becomes a different type of situation where it's as if, you know, when Philip Morris got sued and lost that big lawsuit, well, then smoking became cancerous, and before that it wasn't cancerous. You know, like, smoking wasn't cancerous in the 1950s. It was only in the 90s that it actually became cancerous. Or The world was flat before Galileo and Copernicus decided that it wasn't, or whatever. These things were true before people decided they were true. Like human trafficking and labor exploitation is immoral, and it's a violation of the natural law. Long before some fat guys in suits, and can you imagine how stinky they were? No showers, no soap, right? Sweating all in Washington. A big stinky room full of dudes. Wrote some stuff on paper, and now it's a different situation. Now nobody's allowed to blah, blah, blah. So, but anyway, it every little bit counts. So here we are. Slave trade so the domestic slave trade was just fine apparently. Now I have to imagine there were opponents to slavery all along, and it marginalizes actual paid labor. There are fewer job opportunities, so I got to imagine that it's not like every white man was on board with this. Well, those rich guys get to do whatever they want type of situation. That doesn't make sense. There's a lot of different people in every country, and there's a lot of different people in the early United States too. And there are records of voices of dissent all along. And so I gotta imagine that at least some of these guys who forbade the international trafficking in persons there were intending to at least limit and hopefully reduce and possibly eliminate the domestic slave trade and the domestic practice of slavery within X amount of years. But people got guns, and we've all seen Wild West movies. It wasn't exactly a civilized place. The United States Constitution was developed to unite territory, not necessarily people, and territory against foreign usurpation and foreign occupation and invasion and stuff. So to some extent, it's just impractical. We have a hard time enforcing laws today. Again, if traffickers evade detection and prosecution today, when there's an increased focus, more manpower, more means of tracking shipments, more border guards, all this, if they managed to get away with this stuff today, then it would have been a free-for-all back before electricity, more or less. So historians believe, obviously, that traders continually, not just like here and there, but continually violated an international ban on clandestine slave trade. Conservative estimates hold that smugglers introduced approximately 54,000, or roughly 1,000 people per year. I'm going to push back on that conservative estimate. I think that is a small fraction. I can't even estimate. Nobody can really estimate stuff because there just aren't any records. And I'll continue to get into this. But the way that the slave population grew just doesn't make sense by the numbers. And it's that 54,000, that's a paltry number compared to the 4 million or more that existed in the American South prior to the Civil War. So they had, various sources from university to commercial to journalistic to government confirmed that there was this clandestine or illegal trade, right? Because it was profitable. People do terrible things to make a profit. They still do. And then they paid large bribes to the government officials to ignore the crimes. And that's also a staple, a constant theme through the years, is that if there is profit in it, people will, what was that old famous saying? Go down on the King of Thailand, or roll over on the King of Thailand, which is actually a really big deal not so long ago. The King of Siam, that's what it was. People will say, just like that OJ song, for the love of money, people will stab their brother on their back and, do whatever. Unfortunately, that's just a part of how large groups of people work. Individuals don't always work that way, but when we start talking about millions of people, and even hundreds of thousands of people, or even thousands of people, somebody's going to mess up, and if there's profit in it, then people are going to be able to manipulate their moral compass in such a way that they can justify and rationalize virtually anything. In a previous episode or a couple, I mentioned that individuals do stuff, and then collectively as groups, people do stuff that is horrible. And part of this, I think, is because of the foundational elements of our civilization, that the laws are not necessarily moral. Things are immoral that are legal. Things are illegal which are not immoral. There's Malum and C, Malum and Urey. Slavery is Malum and C, and people knew it back then. It's just not something that people talked about. And you try to convince somebody that they're wrong, you might have a hard time with that. So here we are. Most of the captives who endured illegal slave trade went to the Brazil and Spanish islands and Cuba, and I believe they are still talking about the transatlantic slave trade. There we are. Cuba is very close to Florida, and that is significant because it's closer to Florida than, say, Savannah, Georgia, or Charleston, South Carolina. So many of those trafficked across the ocean to Cuba and British Caribbean were on American ships, but again, the American authorities, just look at some movies. The actors do a pretty decent job of portraying the disgusting demeanor, like the real spineless, sort of sniveling, backstabbing demeanor of the early American who is drunk, and has no qualms about just shooting and being a sick character. 1.65 million captives in the 1800s. That's 13%. And again, these are estimates. I don't have any evidence, nobody has any evidence that actually happened, I suppose, because there's no records, other than the ship's manifest. But it's all estimates. I have no evidence to really prove any of this wrong, but we'll look at the numbers in a moment here. They just don't work out. And this is one of my peeves about people who love numbers, and they want to talk about proportionality and growth and volumes and all this stuff, but then they don't. It's just lazy. It's just lazy mathematics. So back to the 1808 Act, imposed heavy penalties on international traders, but it didn't end slavery or domestic slave sales. It drove the trade underground, and then ships caught illegally trading were brought into the United States and passengers sold onto slavery. This is from the government archives, and so even the federal government is aware of its own stink. And they had some different documents, some evidentiary evidence on that website there. One of them was the Manifest of the Ohio. It was a ship in 1821. It had a list of passengers or cargo. It only showed 2 enslaved women, Betsy and Harriet, being transported from New Orleans to Philadelphia. Okay, so there's from New Orleans to Philadelphia in 1821. It includes a sworn statement of the ship captain that he was not engaged in the transatlantic trade. Is he likely to swear a statement that he was engaged, though? And here's the thing about relying on documentation and evidentiary evidence, which are relics, artifacts. They can be fraudulently produced. Anybody can say anything. People say ridiculous stuff. People write fiction. And so I think it's not just a little bit hilarious and also disturbing that official records and court proceedings are all founded on these personal testimonies. Like, oh, well, he swore it before the Bible. It must be true, or else God will strike him down. He has, it's just so, it's ridiculous. I can't even think of the word. There's probably a word in another language that really shows the meaning there. Here's another one, U.S. v. Schooner's Constitution. So, according to this document, a ship captain was convicted over the ship's cargo because of illegal importation. But the government then just took the people and sold them. and then the proceeds of the sale were turned over to the court. It doesn't exactly suggest that something's just not quite right about all of that. It's hard to imagine what those people thought, because it was nothing good. So a ship was caught illegally importing slaves, and then the government just sold the slaves because they were there already. I don't know. So the decade of 1821 to 1830 saw more than 80,000 people a year leaving Africa on slave ships. Again, estimates. I'm glad that they got zeros at the end there, because they're totally estimates. 1/10 of those carried off in the slave trade era, followed within a million was 1/10. So 10 million, 10.7 million, they like to say, made their way to the United States and Western world. And 90% of them were sent to the Caribbean and South America, or so they say. Only about 6% sent directly to British North America. But still, by 1825, the U.S. population included about 1/4 of the people in the African slave descent. And so here's where the story seems to kind of start to fall apart by the numbers. So only 6% went to the Americas, but then that turned into 25% of the total number. And we're relying on census data, I suppose. Here's an old census form, in 1810, for example. They were assisted by U.S. Marshals, probably because people wanted to just shoot on sight. And they went to these homes and they asked how many people are in the home, and then they asked how many slaves you have in the home, and all, the ages of all the white males and females, and then just how many slaves. So earlier estimates didn't even ask the ages of slaves. And there were no birth certificates, while we're discussing the issue of births and things. It says that half to 3/4 of the births in the United States in the late 19th century, that's the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, went unregistered. And we've seen this argument with voters' rights. So the government, let's just fast forward for a moment. Here's the map from 1755. Look at Florida. Just look at Florida. Look how pathetic Florida is. So how did those government officials ensure that they even got to every village? They didn't. Their perception of what the land looked like was ridiculous. But anyway, again, let's take something at face value. These are the numbers that they are reporting. So here we go. The population of slaves, this is all of slaves. In 1790, 700,000, and that matches the one from the SAT preparation graphic. The population at the end of 1860, 3.9 million, 4 million. We've got a 10-year growth rate of between about 24 and 32%. The assumed birth rate, 50, in the 50s, doesn't break below 50 for, again, this is slave population. Let's compare that to the birth rate of the entire country. We can see a decline in the late 1800s, and then in the more recent years, we're from less than 25. Now, sure, women had more children in the past, but the average birth rate, how do they even calculate these numbers if there were no birth registrations? That if 75 to 90% of births went unregistered, how do they even know how many births there were? If they're not recording them, how do they then have a record? It just doesn't make sense. So by that logic, the average number of children born to a 19th century Southern slave was 9.2, which is twice as many as the West Indies. Now, does that, so they're just, the numbers don't add up. And it's something that somebody should spend, there ought to be a wing at a research company, or at a think tank or university that really pours through these numbers and exposes the deep and broad flaws in this type of methodology. Because when you check across multiple sources, even the estimates don't even match up. So how do they, and then that all begs the question, how do they come up with any of these numbers? Considering that they admit there's a lack of data. It doesn't make sense. Today, here's today. Birth rate, number of children born per woman, highest in the world, Niger, 6.73. So there are 9 countries where the average number of children per woman today is above 5. And that's today. Even in the poorest countries today, there's still better nutrition, better sanitation and hygiene, better medicine than there was in the 19th century South for a slave. But again, let's just withhold, suspend disbelief for a moment, if possible. Another article. These are pretty well-written articles. They are the standard, basically, in this grim topic of 19th century human trafficking and labor exploitation. There are several comparisons between white fertility and slave fertility, and even the interactions between fertility between the two races in a single house. This one shows that the average white woman had a baby every 4 years, the average black woman had a baby every 3 years, with some standard deviation. That's on average. And so what that means is that the average black woman would be having children if they achieved menarche at 12 years old. They would be having children every 3 years until, from 12 plus 27, 9 children times 3 years on average is 27. And so 12 plus 27 is 39, which puts her in the zero fertility range, well past the zero fertility range of 30 in 1860 and steady decline of 30 or 35. 30 or 35. 39 years old is not exactly young today. It's quite rare, really, that a woman nearly 40 or a woman 40 is having children. But what they're saying, and this is confirmed across pretty much every source, because they almost all confirm the natural population growth hypothesis that requires that the average woman, the average black woman, had 9 or more children. And let's just look at some more populations and growth. So we got white population growth of 29% from 1850 to 1860 here, and black population growth of 23.4%, 23.4% between 1850 and 1860. And still we're supposed to think that it just doesn't make sense. So the population grows in the white population grows more than the black population, but somehow slave population growth outpaced white population, such that slave to total population in some states anyway, like Mississippi, 55% of the population was slave. And In other states, like Georgia, 19, 35, 41, 43, slave population growth outpaced the white population growth, even though, in the same, you got one table just above the other. This is such lazy math. It makes my brain hurt. How does the slave population growth outpace the white population growth? In the table just below, we see that the white population growth is increasing at a greater rate than the slave population growth. And then, how does the slave population growth outpace the white population growth when admittedly, the women are having multiple children? That's just history, and they're having close enough to the same number of children. But the mortality rate, infant mortality rate, and death rate among slaves is higher. The life expectancy is shorter. Infant mortality in the South, about half of infants were stillborn. And so of those 9 children, 4 of them would have died before they were old enough to reproduce. And then what that does, but then still, the average lifespan, it's within a couple years for black and white Southerners. And again, these are about the most reliable estimates you can find. This one's for Mississippi in particular. So the top number here, 23.72 versus 22.3, that's from age 20 to 30. That's excluding those who died earlier in childhood. Right? In 1850, including all ages, there was high infant mortality among the white population too. That's just what it was back then. The mean difference here is less than 2 years. And other sources confirm that blacks in the South had life expectancy of like 21 years. And then, so here's a longer life expectancy for whites, 25.5 compared to, for Mississippi, it was lower. So this one's across the entire South. But the death rate for slaves was 1.8% and 1.2% for white. Not terribly different, And part of the reason was, for the shorter lifespan, was obviously more work, greater exposure to the sun and elements, more labor, higher birth rate, and we'll get into that in a moment, and then poor medical care, obviously. These go without saying. Children under the age of 9 accounted for 44% of total mortality. So what we're supposed to believe here is that black and white women were giving birth at not exactly the same rate, but kind of close enough. The whites were living longer, experiencing lower mortality, lower infant mortality, and then still the black population outpaced the white population in terms of growth, when the only significant cause of growth was births. It just doesn't make sense. So let's look at what happened, and then this kind of, is it sexist or something? Is it completely ignorant of the fact that a woman can't have not every woman can have 9 children. Not every woman can have 1 child. It's certainly an average population of 9 children. What happens to women who have multiple children? They experience higher risk of very serious disease, coronary disease, circulatory disease, cancer. Doctors recommend 5 or fewer children. So here's a national Institutes of Health, there's a clear connection between countries that have a higher fertility rate, where women are having 6 to 7 children, and maternal mortality rates. But the slave population in the South had lower lifespan for males. Males died more frequently than females. And so even if the males are doing harder work, it seems that a lot of that should have been recovered. That difference should have been recovered by the seriously increased risk of maternal mortality when they're having so many children. It's just lazy math. And I don't understand how historians get any money. Why is there even a college of history? And they use these tables. Ugh. So with every additional pregnancy, there's an increased risk. Well, maybe one of the reasons that there's just been this focus on what seems to be a red herring, seems to be completely impossible, the natural population growth hypothesis, is because this was a lot of land, it's a lot of money and power that people held, and even after the Civil War, those families that owned those plantations and those slaves still retained their status, and they became the new oligarchs of the South. And then, their sons and their ideas were more prominent in society. And universities and liberal arts departments, these are the literate people. These are the people who, the historians and anthropologists, they are respectful of historical records to the extent that they add value to historical people's perspectives. And until just recently, in the South, they would have been adamantly opposed to any sort of perversion of their family's legacy, and so $4 billion, according to the Economic History Association. Southerners owned close to $4 billion worth of slaves, and they say that, this is then no wonder the South rose to armed resistance to protect this enormous investment. That $4 billion was not exactly erased when emancipation happened. It would have been, as grim as this topic is, this is what it was, that slaves represented assets and they could have borrowed against it. They breathed life into the plantations, and so the land couldn't have been held from acquisition or from foreclosure or whatever had the slaves not been tending to cash crops. And so the wealth of the South was absolutely largely built on the backs of slaves. And then people wanted to protect that in their identity, their legacy, their ego, even after they lost the war. And so what we're supposed to believe is that even though in 2024 women rarely give birth to 5 or more children without a second thought, historians believe the average slave gave birth to 9 or more, up to half of whom died before reproductive years. And despite all the contradictory numbers suggesting slave population growth probably resulted from importation after 1808. Despite the legacy of smuggling and cartel behavior in the United States, historians brush over the apparent influence of piracy, human trafficking organizations, official complicity, and its role in creating preconditions for civil war. So $4 billion by inflation. Inflation at the Fed only starts in 1913 or 1900, thereabouts. But it's over $30. So $1 in 1860 is about $37, we'll call it. So 4 billion times 35, we'll give it times 35. So if $1 in the 1860s were $35 now, then that 4 billion is 140 billion by today's standards, which is greater than the GDP of about 14 states. So regardless of, even if those families' fortunes were lost, they retained their status. We have how many statues of these Civil War generals and how many women and their daughters of the Confederacy, and how many parades still all through the South that are, tours of these mansions, and these people dress up in funny costumes and pretend like it's still then. They retained that part of their cultural identity. They just got rid of the practice of slavery. And I guess chain gangs are the default go-to for, did they really? So a lot of wealth gets created, and that massive influence doesn't just transfer to the Northerners. The carpetbaggers didn't run away with all of that. The Great Migration was of the people who, were unable to live in the South. The great big family plantations stayed in those families, and those are the good old boys. Like the real top-notch good old boys, who are bad. Why do we call them good? So let's just go back to the numbers, because this is such lazy thinking. And what it really is, it's moralizing an immoral time period. It's negotiating reality. If people are completely ignoring the fact that these numbers don't make sense, and they are, and they're completely relying on the idea that this was just domestic slave trade and the natural population growth, which it just doesn't make sense, then they're basically saying that Americans aren't criminals. Slavery was legal, and my great grandpappy wasn't a criminal. He wasn't no criminal. Well, in that case, the double negative definitely works out, friend. So here we are in 1830. Remember, all these other states came into existence after the ban. So we've got Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, Missouri, Florida, which is the cotton states. That's the Cotton Belt. These other states over here, Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, they came in before the ban. But then how did they even get all of those people across that great big country? Did they, one by one, did they walk? The logistics are ridiculous, and I think I have a slide on that one in a moment. But let's look at, so for example, growth in Georgia. Tripled between 1820 and 1860 in 40 years. So we've got a man and a woman. The woman has 9 children, 4 of whom died. That leaves 5. The average lifespan was 20 years. And so there would have been 2 generations dead in the 40 years between 1820 and 1860. To double the population, you need to leave behind 4. So I guess that makes sense. They could double, maybe. But how then do we get the total number? That's just one state. And then we're supposed to believe that not only did that state double its numbers, triple its numbers, but they also exported slaves to, say, Louisiana, which had 69,000, and then 330,000, nearly 5 times as many in 40 years. And Mississippi at 32,000 in 1820, and 12 times as many, nearly 11 times as many, no more, 13 times as many, roughly, in 40 years. That really doesn't make any sense. And so in all of these other states, North Carolina, okay, maybe that's reasonable with the birth rate and death rate that's actually possible. What else? Other new states. Let's look at Tennessee. 80,000 to 275,000. That's a threefold increase, more than threefold increase. Virginia, a little increase. So they had reached their carrying capacity, roughly. But all states total, little less than threefold increase. In some states, you got Mississippi a 13-time increase. Louisiana, nearly 5 times. Let's look, where's Alabama? Alabama from 41,000 to 43,000, nearly 11-fold increase. Arkansas, 90-fold increase from 1,000 to, and that's where rate and total don't always match up, but the difference in numbers is just not supported by this idea this is all from, nobody had birth control and there weren't any abortions. Not on average, maybe in one state if none left. Maybe, but that would be a whole lot of baby making. And it just doesn't, it doesn't make sense. So, and cotton boomed after 1810. So the whole cotton plantation system we're supposed to believe that this was all just domestic slave trade. The Cotton Bowl, and then coincidentally, the Cotton Bowl, the cotton region, was mostly on the Gulf, and then right up the Mississippi River. Well, isn't that an easy place for a boat to land? But so those boats traveling on these maps. Let's just look at, 1755 is kind of out of the question. That's ridiculous. But in 1814, Cuba was west of the 85th parallel. And what most of the seafarers were probably dealing with was something more like this, where I guess that one might even be, you can see in reality, Cuba is east of the 85th parallel. And here you got Cuba just south of the tip of Florida. 1814, it's west of the 86th parallel. It's like the 87th parallel. So they thought it was really close to Louisiana and Mobile. In fact, you can see that Mobile is nearly directly north of Cuba in this map. Whereas in reality, I guess it kind of is. It's not too far. But it's not nearly as far west as they thought. So they thought that Cuba was closer than it actually is. I guess that doesn't really matter so much, but the maps weren't exactly stellar, They didn't even know what the sea looked like. They could travel around on it, but how did they get these numbers? I just don't want to know how dumb, how many beers people had to come up with these numbers. So what's more likely, in my opinion, is that, listen, if somebody's going to engage in slave trading, I don't think that they're going to find any real moral distinction between where they got those slaves. I think that they will take certain precautions to kind of ensure that they don't get caught way out in the Atlantic on the eastern seaboard where most of the U.S. government is. The states don't enforce the federal law. The federal law is enforced by the federal government. And let's just say the South wasn't exactly friendly to federal agents. That's mostly like an East Coast thing, eh? In the years running up to the Civil War, do you think that there were that many federal agents who were just doing their duties down in the South? I just kind of doubt it. I have my doubts, friend. Let's take a look at, Cuba. Cuba would have taken about 3 days to get from Mobile to Cuba. Well, by boat today. But anyway, it's 765 nautical. Well, it's 10 knots. Can you go 10 knots on a sailboat? I hope so. 765 nautical miles. It's a lot closer than, say, Charlotte, which is 1,205. Charlotte's about the same distance, close enough, as Montego Bay, Jamaica. And given the prices of slaves, they could have gone all the way to St. Kitts. Sure, it's 2,100 nautical miles, but if you get a discount, I suppose these people were not concerned about the law, no matter how much they say they were just so bold that they're writing down how many people they're carrying around in shackles. Maybe, they just toss that overboard when it's convenient, or whatever. You can make up anything on a document. But here, prices are generally going to be something that, because business owners keep records. So here's the price of slave in the Caribbean. It's from 1807. Let's just look at 1807. The price of a slave in the Caribbean in 1807 was maybe $60. We'll call it $60. Or 60 pounds sterling. 60 pounds sterling. And here, the price of a slave in, this is going to be Charleston, in 1807 was $300. Now let's just double check, make sure the pound sterling, let's see, pound sterling to US dollar conversion, 1800s. $5 to every pound sterling. So 1 British pound is worth about $4.44. So 60 pounds sterling was worth about $240. In 1809, $375. The deflated value, let's just go, because it runs up to nominal prices at $414. Let's settle on $350 versus times $56, call it $60 times 4 is $240, $250, call it, versus $350. If they could save nearly 30% and travel a little bit farther or travel a lot less, I'm just guessing that that's what they would do. Just my guess. I'm no human trafficker, but I'm guessing that price influenced their choice in vendors, and especially since Havana was quite a lot closer. And if as we're supposed to believe, 90% of the slaves went to the Caribbean and South America, and if the Caribbean slave population was 4 million versus only whatever in the United States, then as supply is higher, so demand, or, there would have been trade around the regions. I'm sure they had old scurvy sea captains who were bringing slaves between all those islands there too. Main point is that there's at least another option that I haven't much heard anything about, which is like maybe a third of the growth in the population in the U.S. was due to illegal importation, and that would sure compromise the whole idea that, well, aren't those government officials just law-abiding characters, and that would make sense as far as why the North decided to invade the South too, because there's this proliferation of slavery and this really untenable, volatile situation where you got corrupt officials and people, hanging and they got people doing whatever they want all over the place, and that's a recipe for disaster at increasing rate. Not only have they not done the right thing generally, but they're also just flouting all the laws that the federal government wants to implement because there's cash in it, and they're in cahoots with all these pirates in the Caribbean, and who knows what sort of British re-invasion, who knows what the political military situation was in the mid to late 1800s. The United States was obviously on shaky territory, on shaky ground. So history, friends, requires faith. Because I wasn't there, you weren't there, nobody was there. The communications, like they had carrier pigeons, they were sending mail by boat, It wasn't exactly the modern age where people can Skype and FaceTime and stuff. There's pirates, and there's corrupt officials like on the record, and there's like Willie Lynch, and there's human trafficking that's legalized, right? It wasn't exactly a time where you could trust a whole lot of what people say, who knows how many other assorted abuses there were in that time. Nobody knows. We can only assume that there were a lot. And what we shouldn't do is trust their record. We should look at everything with a very skeptical eye. People were ignorant. The average person couldn't really read. They just, they'd go and listen to the preacher on Sunday who probably participated in the slave auction directly after church, as if to just like put a thumb in the eye of everything that's holy and decent. They have slave auctions in Charleston after church on Sunday. That's ridiculous. And people are just ignorant of their rights. They're ignorant of what's right and wrong. They were insane. They're drinking beer all day and whiskey. Believed in spirits and things. Before electric light, Edison's electric light bulb came on way after that. The first electric light was 1802. But it's before electrification. The steam locomotive barely made it in that period. Pasteurization's just before the Civil War. Periodic table of elements after, telephone after, radio waves after, atomic theory way after. So communications were just not, they weren't good. Keeping records, not good. If they didn't like a record, they throw it away. Burn it. That's the story of history. Papers exist that made it their way to the present day, but who knows how legitimate they are? We don't know. We know that somebody said that it's good. It's just like word of mouth and trust in people. But that's not exactly reliable at scale, because people do stuff for their own selfish purposes. The lies died with those men or whatever, and and that's the rationalization they make, that they're going to tell a big fat lie and they're going to keep it until they die. There's at least another option. There's at least another possibility. And then other records would just burn. It should go without saying that history requires way too much faith to be all that believable. And then there are incomplete surveys of populations using maps that were, let's just say, less than accurate. And the wealthy power players are in charge of a lot of stuff, and they had serious coercive methods. And so they use these purposeful they'll seek a result and they'll get that result. It might hold partial validity, but it can't exactly frame the basis for a truth claim. And then what's the takeaway here? That if we understand history, then maybe we won't repeat it. Today is tomorrow's history. Like in 200 years from now, there's going to be documentation from today's internet that are just ridiculous. And hopefully the internet is distributed widely enough that people won't be able to burn the stuff they don't like, or destroy the stuff they don't like. But you could read about aliens from the Pentagon today. Why do the aliens only visit the idiots and the drunks and the people looking to make a paycheck? Why do the aliens only visit Americans, basically? Nobody else talks about that nonsense. Bigfoot, flat earth, chemtrails. George Soros is a puppeteer. And these are all truths to a lot of people. Trump won the election in 2020. The moon landing's a hoax. CIA invented rap music to destroy America. Meanwhile, they force-fed everybody crack. They not only organized the shipment of the crack cocaine, but they made everybody take it. It was just a big plot to undermine. You could read about just about anything. Those are historical records. Doesn't mean they're true. Anything Alex Jones says is a historical record. It doesn't mean it's reliable. It doesn't mean you should believe it. And so the simplest explanation really shouldn't be discounted, but I think the simplest explanation is that there was real significant importation of slaves and trafficking in persons into the United States after 1808 until the Civil War. And it still continues today. Human trafficking still continues today. Today. And so one of these tables had 0 as the number who came in, 0, the number imported. In 1840, 1850, 0. Well, that doesn't happen in 2020. It doesn't happen now. It has never happened. There's always been at least one slave It might not have been across the Atlantic Ocean on a sailboat with, on a British sea captain's boat or whatever, but zero is not the number, friends. The most obvious and simplest answer is not that every black woman in the antebellum South had an iron uterus and was able to fly and defy gravity and having 9 or more children on average. That's just not the simplest explanation. While also living with very poor nutrition, so much that they would eat dirt. That was one of the causes of mortality in one of those articles. Dirt eating, because they just don't have any minerals, because they're not free to choose, basically. The simplest thing is not that historians have it right in not offering other ideas, in not contemplating the possibility that, like, the sum of records is woefully incomplete at best, and it is a fabrication at worst. And call it a conspiracy theory or whatever, but at least it's a theory, whereas the hypothesis that natural population boom led to 4 million or more African slaves in the American South prior to the Civil War is just silly on its face, given the numbers. They even the numbers contradict themselves from one paragraph to the next, and the historians don't even recognize what they're doing. The liberal artists need to learn themselves some numbers. And they have their demands. They got academic demands, social, cultural, financial reasons. Maybe this or that sponsor won't promote them. Like I said, the big chummy power players and the good old boys back in the day sat upon the universities and told people what was true rather than discovering what was true. They just told it however they wanted it rather than how it is. And then over time, people just learn to do like this, or else they aren't going to get the benefit, and that's liberal arts, that's journalism, that's writing papers. If you want to make your way as an academic where your worth is based on your publishability, and publishing houses won't even consider your articles if they don't go with the mainstream ideas, if they're too different, then I guess you might likely make that bargain. But it's at the cost of reliability and accuracy, or at least a more comprehensive approach to methodology, which is severely lacking in this issue. So today, people don't argue that the border is just all sealed up and nobody gets into this country or that country without a record. That's ridiculous. We've got 30 million undocumented people or more, or less. I don't know. How many undocumented people are there? We don't know. They don't have any documents. Same as births in the 1800s and even into the 1900s. There just aren't any records. So statisticians come up with their models, but models are just that. They're like estimates. It's not exact. It's not something you want to put a ones place on. Like you don't want to say there were 3,494,507. If it's a model, just put a bunch of zeros at give me fewer significant digits, please. I mean, who's going to argue that the government has eradicated an illicit trade today? Nobody. They haven't eradicated any criminal activity. Each year, the United States Department of State puts out its trafficking in persons report because there are still people trafficked for the purpose of various forms of slavery into the United States and the West, from source and destination countries. A big flow of migrants when they're not even going on sailboats where they can maybe escape the documentation. They're going by road, in continent, I suppose, but they're going by plane too. Everybody who flies on a plane has a record. They got to go through a port if you fly on a plane. Sure, they're coming in cargo ships occasionally, but ridiculous, folks. Ridiculous. It still happens today. For sex, for other forms, for labor. Some estimates, like A. Blinken, has it at 27, 28 million currently worldwide. In the United States, 2,000 people were reported for human trafficking offenses in 2021. 2,000 in 2021. And let's just say they trafficked one person each. That's 2,000 people in 2021. And we're supposed to believe that they had it better managed in the 1800s when they didn't even have roads. They didn't have there's no passport. People didn't have documents for identification. They didn't have surveillance technology. The ILO estimates 40 million people are victims of slavery worldwide today. Forced labor exploitation. 40 million compared to a much smaller number back in the day. 40 million people. Today, that's today. If they can't get it under wraps today, look at all those dots. This is all the cases, the reported cases. In virtually every country, there are approximately 200 countries. In virtually every country, virtually every nationality, going to and from all over the world. And that's today. And then we're supposed to believe that human trafficking in the 1800s into the United States had been eradicated or nearly eradicated, such that on the average day, only 3, if it was 1,000 per year to give 54,000 total in that stretch, then only 3 people on that big, long eastern, on that huge shoreline, only 3 people were transported in the United States. When they found ships of 100 each, 80 something. So that 100 would have been like the whole month's arrival. Just lazy math, folks. And let's come up with a new figure of speech. Like if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it. Well, like if you don't learn math, then you're not gonna get the right answer or something like that. Right? Because I don't think this is the right answer, that this was all 6% of all of the transatlantic slave trade ended up in the United States, and that all that growth from 0.7 to 40 in a matter of 70 years, 25% growth nationwide, in some states 1,000% growth over 40 years in the population, with all of those conditions of child mortality, poor living conditions, backbreaking labor, exposure, poor nutrition, shorter lifespan. And despite statistics that show the white population was increasing at a greater rate than the black population, yet still the black population somehow overcame the white population in some states or grew at a faster rate. Somebody didn't do their homework. This has been the T. The reading room is now closed.